The morning Belle Bancroft counted the coins in the cash drawer for the third time and still came up short. She knew with cold certainty that her father's store had exactly 11 days left before the bank foreclosed on everything her family had built over the past 2 decades. She set the coins down on the worn wooden counter and pressed her palms flat against the surface, staring at the numbers she had scratched into the ledger in her neat, careful hand. $43.16. The debt to Harlan Griggs at First Territorial Bank of Dusty Creek, Colorado was $220, and it was due on the 15th of October, 1882. It was the 4th of October right now, and the shelves of Bancroft General Store were growing thinner every week because Belle could not afford to restock what she sold, and half the town had started buying on credit from Griggs's new mercantile on the other end of Main Street. Belle straightened her back, tucked a dark curl behind her ear, and lifted her chin the way her mother used to do when things got hard. Her mother had been gone 6 years now, taken by fever in the summer of 1876, and her father, Thomas Bancroft, had been bedridden for the past 3 months with a lung sickness that made him cough through most of the night. The doctor, old Willis Crane, said Thomas needed rest, warm broth, and no stress. Belle had smiled and nodded and then gone back to running a store that was slowly dying around her. She was 23 years old and she had never felt so alone in all her life. The bell above the door jangled and she looked up with the bright, practiced smile she had learned to produce on command, expecting one of the usual morning customers. Old Mrs. Pettigrew, perhaps, coming in for her weekly tin of coffee and a long conversation about her various ailments. Or maybe the Dobson boys, who liked to linger near the penny candy and had to be watched carefully. But the man who stepped through the door of Bancroft General Store on that cool October morning was not anyone Belle had ever seen before. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the doorframe seem smaller than it actually was, and he wore trail dust on his coat like most men wore their names, openly and without apology. His hat was a deep charcoal gray, wide-brimmed and well-made, tilted back just enough that she could see his face clearly. He had a strong jaw darkened by several days of growth, dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of the Colorado sky on a clear afternoon, a deep, clean blue that caught the light when he glanced around the store. He was not what Belle would have called classically handsome, not in the soft, painted way of the portraits she had seen in mail-order catalogs. He was something more immediate than that, something weathered and real and intensely present, the kind of man who filled a room not because he was loud but because there was a solidity to him, a kind of quiet gravity. He looked around the store for a moment, and Belle watched his eyes travel across the half-empty shelves, the gaps where flour sacks used to stand 3 deep, the lonely row of canned goods that she had rearranged twice that week just to make the shelves look fuller than they were. "Good morning," Belle said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Welcome to Bancroft General Store. Can I help you find something?" The man looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted slightly, though she could not have named exactly what it was. He had the look of a man who had been a long time on the trail and was not entirely sure yet what civilized company felt like. "Morning, ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, carrying a slight Texas drawl that softened the edges of his words. He pulled off his hat and held it in both hands, which she thought was unexpectedly courteous. "Name's Albert Mercer. I just rode in from Pueblo, planning to stay in Dusty Creek for a while." "Belle Bancroft," she said, and nodded toward the shelves. "I am afraid we are a little low on some items at the moment, but I can order anything you need." Albert Mercer looked around the store again, slowly and deliberately, in the way a man looks at something when he is making up his mind about it. He walked to the nearest shelf and picked up a tin of sardines, turned it over in his hand, set it back. He walked further and looked at the fabric bolts, the mostly empty barrel of dried beans, the scant row of medicines and liniments near the back wall. Belle watched him and tried not to let the embarrassment show on her face. She knew what the store looked like. She had been watching it empty out for months. Albert came back to the counter and set his hat on the surface beside the cash drawer. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at Belle with those clear blue eyes, and there was something in his expression that was not pity, exactly, because it lacked the softness of pity. It was more like recognition, the way a man looks at a situation he understands. "Miss Bancroft," he said carefully, "I am going to ask you something direct, and I hope you will not take offense by it." Belle held herself very still. "Go ahead, Mr. Mercer. Is this store in trouble?" The directness of it knocked the breath from her for just a moment. She had grown so accustomed to not saying the thing plainly, to smiling and rearranging shelves and talking about how business was just a little slow this season, that being asked the plain question felt like cold water on her face. "Yes," she said, and was surprised by how much relief came with the single syllable. "Yes, it is." Albert Mercer nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. He looked at the shelves again, then back at her, and there was a long pause in which the store was very quiet except for the distant sound of horses on the street outside. "I need a good store," he said at last. "I am going to be in this town for a while, and I need supplies, provisions, and a place I can rely on for restocking when I need it. I would like to do my business here." He paused. "All my business. Starting today." Belle looked at him carefully. "I appreciate that, Mr. Mercer, but I should tell you honestly that my inventory is—" "I can see what your inventory is," he said, not unkindly. "And I would like to buy what you have." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. What you have on the shelves," he said. "I would like to buy it, all of it or most of it, whatever I can use and whatever I can store. I have just come off a long cattle drive and I have pay in my pocket and I need to spend some of it on provisions." He said it simply, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, as if men came into half-empty stores and bought the shelves clean every day of the week. Belle stared at him for a moment and then found her voice. "Mr. Mercer, I think you should know the total value of what is on these shelves would come to." "I trust your arithmetic," he said, and for the first time the corner of his mouth curved upward very slightly, and it was not quite a smile but it was the suggestion of one. "Write it down and I will pay it." Belle looked at him for a long moment, trying to read the situation, trying to find the angle, because in her experience men did not simply walk into stores and offer to buy everything off the shelves out of the goodness of their hearts. There had to be something underneath it. But Albert Mercer met her gaze directly, and there was nothing there that looked like manipulation. He looked tired from the road and straightforward and entirely sincere, and Belle decided, in the way she had learned to make quick decisions out of necessity, to take him at his word. She picked up her pencil and began to walk the shelves. It took her the better part of an hour to catalog everything and put prices to it, because she was careful and she wanted to be fair, and she noticed that Albert Mercer did not rush her. He sat on the wooden bench near the door that Thomas had put there years ago for waiting customers, and he stretched his long legs out before him and tilted his head back and appeared to doze lightly, though she suspected he was more alert than he looked. When she brought him the final tally, he opened his eyes immediately, which confirmed her suspicion. He took the paper and read it carefully, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and counted out the money without a word of negotiation or complaint. He laid it on the counter in clean stacks and Belle counted it after him, because she had learned never to skip that step, and it was all there. $112.40. It was not enough to pay the full debt to Griggs. But it was more money than Belle had seen in one place in months, and it meant she could reorder stock, which meant she could sell again, which meant she had a fighting chance. She looked up from the money and found Albert watching her, and there was that not-quite smile again. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that went deeper than the simple words could carry. "Thank you, Miss Bancroft," he said, standing and picking up his hat. "You gave me a fair price on everything." He glanced around the now nearly empty shelves. "I expect I will need more provisions in a week or so. I hope you will be open for business." "We will be open," Belle said, and she believed it now in a way she had not believed it an hour ago. Albert Mercer nodded once, put his hat back on his head and walked out the door. The bell jangled behind him. Belle stood at the counter looking at the stacked money and feeling, for the first time in months, like she might actually be able to breathe. She was already halfway through a mental list of what to order when her father's voice drifted down from the apartment above the store, thin but awake, asking if she had opened yet. She smiled, tucked the money safely into the lock box under the counter, and went to make his morning broth. She did not tell Thomas about the money right away. She made his broth and sat with him while he drank it and told him business was looking up, which was true, and she let him rest. And then she went back downstairs and wrote out her supply orders with a steadier hand than she had used in months. The freight wagon from Denver came twice a month, and the next run was due in 5 days. If she got her orders in by tomorrow morning's post, she could have a restocked store in less than a week. She worked through the afternoon in a state of carefully controlled optimism, not letting herself count chickens but letting herself believe, just barely, that there was a path forward. The next morning she took the orders to the post office herself, walked back past the bank, and had the misfortune of passing Harlan Griggs on the front steps. Harlan Griggs was 51 years old, silver-haired, and wore his prosperity the way some men wore weapons, as a form of threat. He had come to Dusty Creek in 1875, the same year the railroad surveyors passed through, and he had understood immediately that the town was going to grow. He had bought land and buildings while they were cheap, and sold them or leased them when they were not, and he had opened the first territorial bank of Dusty Creek in 1878. He had also, in 1881, opened his own mercantile 2 blocks from Bancroft General Store, which most of the town understood to be his way of pushing Thomas Bancroft out. He was not a violent man in the common understanding of the word. He was something quieter and in some ways worse. He was patient and methodical, and he understood money the way a surgeon understood a scalpel, as a thing that could cut with great precision. "Miss Bancroft," he said, tipping his hat with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, "I have been meaning to call on you about the matter of your father's loan." "The payment is due on the 15th, Belle said evenly. "We are aware of the date." "Of course you are," Griggs said smoothly. "I only wanted to mention that there may be other arrangements available to you. The debt could be restructured, for instance, in exchange for certain considerations." Belle looked at him carefully. "What considerations?" Griggs smiled again, and this time there was something underneath the smile that made her skin prickle. "The deed to the building, perhaps. Your father could continue to operate the store as a tenant. It might relieve the financial pressure considerably." Belle understood immediately what he was offering and what it would mean. He wanted the building. Once he had the building, he could raise the rent whenever he chose, or he could simply wait until they fell behind on rent payments and evict them. It would be the end of Bancroft General Store just as surely as the foreclosure, only slower and more prolonged. "I appreciate the offer," she said, keeping her voice entirely pleasant, "but we intend to make the payment in full on the 15th. Good morning, Mr. Griggs." She walked away before he could respond and did not allow herself to hurry. She was shaking slightly by the time she reached the store, and she stood in the back storeroom for a few minutes with her eyes closed, reminding herself that she still had 11 days, and now she had over $100 and a restocked store coming. It was not over. She opened her eyes and went back to work. Albert Mercer came back to the store 3 days later. On a Saturday morning, when the light was slanting golden through the front windows and Belle had just finished putting up a new display of the leather goods that had arrived in an early partial shipment from Denver. She heard the bell and looked up, and felt something move in her chest when she saw who it was, something that startled her because she had not expected it. He looked better than he had 3 days ago. He had shaved, or most of the way shaved, leaving just a short, neat beard that suited the lines of his face. He wore a clean shirt of deep blue that made his eyes look even more striking, and his hat was the same charcoal gray but brushed clean of the trail dust. He was still obviously a man who lived outdoors and worked hard, but there was something more settled about him now, as if 2 nights in a proper bed had restored some equilibrium. "Morning, Miss Bancroft," he said, glancing around at the shelves with open appreciation. "You have been busy." "The freight wagon came yesterday," Belle said, and she could hear the pride in her own voice and did not try to hide it. "I still have more coming on the regular run next week, but I think you will find we have most of what a person could need." Albert walked the shelves slowly, the way he had the first time, with that same quiet deliberateness, except this time there was something different in it. This time he was not assessing a failing store. He was browsing, the way a man browses when he is actually interested in what he sees. He stopped at the leather goods display and picked up a well-stitched pair of riding gloves, turned them over, tested the flex of the leather. "Good quality," he said. "I order from a supplier in Denver," Belle said. "My father had a relationship with him for years. He sends us the best of what he has." Albert set the gloves down and looked at her. "How is your father?" The question surprised her. She had not mentioned her father to him at all during their first meeting. She looked at him for a moment, wondering how he had come to know, and then she remembered that small towns did what small towns always did. "He is resting," she said. "He has been ill, but he is improving." This was perhaps a more optimistic account than Dr. Crane would have given, but it was the account Belle chose to give, because the alternative felt like a surrender she was not ready to make. Albert nodded. "I am glad to hear it." He continued through the store and eventually brought a substantial collection of items to the counter. Rope, dried beef, canned goods, ammunition for a Winchester, a new bedroll strap, 2 tins of coffee, a sack of flour, the leather gloves, and a bar of the lavender soap that Belle had included in her reorder almost on impulse and now suspected had been a good decision. While Belle tallied the items, Albert leaned against the counter and looked around the store again with that steady, considering gaze. "You did all of this yourself?" he asked. "The restocking, the display?" "There is only me," Belle said simply. Albert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a lot for one person." "It is what is needed," Belle said, and added up the final number and turned the ledger toward him. He paid and picked up his paper-wrapped parcels and seemed in no great hurry to leave, which was not unpleasant. Most of her customers, when they were done buying, moved toward the door. Albert Mercer seemed comfortable standing still. "What brought you to Dusty Creek, if you do not mind my asking?" Belle said, because she was curious and because the store was quiet and because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to keep him talking for a little while. He considered the question before answering, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he approached most things. "I was foreman on a cattle drive out of Texas," he said. "We delivered the herd at Pueblo, the drive boss paid out, and I found myself with money in my pocket and no particular place I needed to be. I have been moving around a fair amount for the past several years." He paused. Dusty Creek seemed like a town that might be worth staying in for a while. Belle looked at him carefully. "What makes a town worth staying in?" Something shifted in his expression again, that subtle movement she had noticed the first day. "Hard to say exactly," he said. "You know it when you see it, I think." He picked up his parcels, touched the brim of his hat, and said he would be back before the week was out. Belle watched the door swing closed behind him and stood for a moment in the quiet of the store, turning the conversation over in her mind the way you turn a found coin over in your hand, examining it for something you cannot quite name. She made herself go back to work. He came back on Wednesday, as he had said he would, and on that visit he stayed nearly an hour. He had questions about some of the farming supplies, because he had mentioned, almost in passing, that he was considering whether there might be land to lease north of town, and Belle knew more about the land around Dusty Creek than most people expected her to, because Thomas had always made a point of understanding the country around the store. She found herself engaged in a real conversation, the kind she rarely had these days, about soil quality and water rights and what crops had done well in this part of Colorado. Albert listened the way she liked to be listened to, with his full attention and without interrupting, and when he had a question he asked it straight out, no hedging. He bought more supplies before he left, and he said, with that understated almost smile, that he thought she knew more about this territory than he did, which, coming from a man who had crossed it several times on cattle drives, seemed like something worth saying. That evening, when Belle brought Thomas his supper and sat with him while he ate, she told him about a customer who had come in and bought a great deal. She did not give all the details, but she watched something ease in her father's thin face when she told him the supply orders were covered for the month. "Good," Thomas said in his rough voice. "I always said this store would outlast anything Griggs tried to do to it." He paused and looked at her with eyes that were still sharp even when the rest of him was not at full strength. "You look different today, Belle." "I am tired," she said, which was true. "No," her father said, and there was something gently knowing in his expression that she did not entirely like because it saw too much. "Not tired, something else." "Eat your supper, Papa," Belle said, and changed the subject. She lay awake that night longer than she usually did, watching the moonlight move across the ceiling of her small room above the store, and she tried to understand why a practical and clear-headed young woman who had far more important things to worry about kept thinking about a pair of clear blue eyes. She did not arrive at a satisfactory answer before she fell asleep. The following Sunday, Belle closed the store for the afternoon as she always did, and walked to the little stone church at the top of the rise where Pastor Hewitt gave his weekly sermon. She sat in her usual pew, third from the front on the left, and was just settling in with her hymnal when she saw Albert Mercer come through the door at the back. He looked uncertain in the way people sometimes do when they enter a church in a new town, not quite sure of the customs or where to sit. He stood just inside the door for a moment, and then his eyes found Belle, and she saw the uncertainty ease slightly, replaced by something more deliberate. He walked up the aisle and stopped at her pew. "May I?" he said quietly, and nodded at the seat beside her. Belle moved her hymnal. "Please," she said. He sat beside her, and the pew was narrow enough that she was aware of him in a way that was purely physical, the warmth and solidity of him, the slight scent of leather and the cedar soap she had sold him 2 weeks ago. The sermon was about perseverance, which Belle thought was either providential or simply appropriate to the general human condition, and she spent equal parts of it listening to Pastor Hewitt and being quietly, helplessly aware of the man beside her. When the service ended and they were filing out into the crisp October sunlight, Albert walked beside her down the church steps and did not seem in a hurry to peel away, so Belle did not either. "Do you always go alone?" he asked. "For the past several months," she said. "My father cannot manage the walk right now." Albert nodded, looking out at the street. The town was quiet on Sunday afternoons, with most people either at church or at home, and Main Street had the particular hush of a place temporarily at rest. "Would you walk with me a while?" he asked, "if you have no pressing obligations." The store was closed. Thomas was sleeping. Belle could think of no honest reason to say no and found that she did not want to. "I would like that," she said. They walked the length of Main Street and then out along the northern road, where the cottonwoods were beginning to turn gold in the October cold. Albert talked about the country north of town that he had ridden out to look at the previous day, the lay of the land, the way the creek ran, whether the soil showed the right kind of look for certain crops. Belle told him about the history of the land around Dusty Creek, which she knew from years of listening to her father and the homesteaders who came into the store. She mentioned, because it seemed relevant to his questions about land, that the northern Arapaho and Cheyenne people had been systematically displaced from this territory over the preceding decades, that the land Albert was looking at had not been empty land waiting for someone to claim it, that the history of how it came to be available was not a simple or comfortable one. She was not sure why she said it, except that it was true and it felt dishonest to pretend otherwise, and she had always had a difficulty with comfortable dishonesty. Albert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I saw it firsthand in Texas." His voice was level and had something in it that was not guilt exactly, but was something more useful than guilt, something like honest reckoning. The whole cattle business runs on land that was taken, one way or another. I have thought about that for a long time. It was not a thing she had expected him to say, and she found it changed something in how she saw him. They turned back toward town when the afternoon light began to deepen toward evening, and as they came back down Main Street, they passed the front of the First Territorial Bank. Belle's eyes went to it involuntarily, and Albert noticed. "The bank," he said. "We owe money," Belle said, because she was past the point of pretty evasions with this man. "The debt is due in 9 days. Albert was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "Will you make it?" Belle thought about the money in the lock box, the restocked shelves, the orders for the current week. "I need to bring in another $107 in the next 9 days, she said. "It is possible if we have good business." Albert turned this over in that way he had. "What would help?" "Saturday is usually the best day," she said. "The ranchers and homesteaders come in. If I can have everything they need on those shelves, I have a real chance." He nodded, and she thought he was going to say something encouraging and polite, the way people do when they cannot actually help but want to seem as though they understand. Instead he said, "I have been thinking of ordering some things for the bunkhouse at the Callaway Ranch. I have been staying there while I sort out the land question. I could put the order in this week." Belle looked at him. "Mr. Mercer, Albert," he said. The informality surprised her into a small silence. In 1882, in a small Colorado town, first names between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman of respectable standing were not a casual thing. It was not improper exactly, but it was an intimacy, and he had offered it simply and without pretense. "Albert," she said, and was aware of how differently the world arranged itself when she said it. "You do not have to manufacture reasons to spend money at the store." "I am not manufacturing anything," he said. "I genuinely need supplies for the bunkhouse, and I would rather buy them from you than from Griggs." He paused, and now that almost smile was fully in place. "Though I do admit I also enjoy the company." Belle felt warmth move through her face, and she looked at the road ahead of them rather than at him. "I enjoy it as well," she said, and kept her voice even with some effort. They reached the door of the store and stopped, and the afternoon had that particular amber quality of late October in Colorado, the light doing beautiful and fleeting things with the cottonwood gold and the weathered wood of the storefronts. "Thank you for the walk, Belle," Albert said. "Thank you for the company," she said, and meant it more than she had meant almost anything in a long time. He touched his hat and went, and she stood in the door of the store for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching him walk down the street, and then she shook herself and went upstairs to start Thomas's supper. The next morning she found a paper on the counter that she did not remember leaving there. It was a list of bunkhouse supplies in a clear, direct hand, with prices already looked up and a note at the bottom that said, "I hope this helps with Saturday." The total came to $64. She had not understood until that moment exactly how much trouble she was in with herself. She filled the order. The week that followed was the busiest Belle had had in the store since her father had fallen ill, and she attributed it partly to the restocked shelves, partly to the cold snap that drove people in for winter provisions, and partly to something she could not entirely account for but suspected had to do with the fact that she had started running the store again with something that felt like genuine hope rather than grim necessity. People noticed things like that, she had found. They came into a store differently when the person behind the counter believed in what they were selling. Albert came in on Tuesday for his bunkhouse order and carried the heavier items out to his wagon himself without being asked, which saved Belle considerable effort. He stayed for coffee, which she offered because it seemed rude not to, and they sat on the stools behind the counter with tin cups and talked for the better part of an hour about everything and nothing in particular. His years on the cattle drives, her childhood growing up in the store with a father who believed that a general store was the heart of a community, the way the mountains looked in early winter when the snow came down to the tree line. She learned that he was 28 years old, that he had grown up in West Texas, that his father had been a rancher who had lost his land in a drought when Albert was 17, that he had gone onto the cattle drives because it was what he knew and what paid reliably, and that he had been thinking for the past year or so about whether there was a different kind of life available to him, something with more ground under it, something that stayed in one place. She told him about growing up behind this counter, about learning to read from the labels on the canned goods when she was 4, about how her mother had kept the books with a precision that Belle had tried to inherit, about how Thomas had always said the store was not a business, but a relationship with the town around it, and how she had understood what he meant but not quite believed it the way he did until she was older. Albert listened to all of it with his full, quiet attention, and she noticed that he remembered things she had said in previous conversations and built on them, which was a quality she had found rare and which she found she valued enormously. On Thursday, Harlan Griggs came into the store. Belle was rearranging the medicine shelf when the bell jangled, and she turned and found Griggs in the doorway, hat in hand, wearing his careful smile. Behind him, almost as an afterthought, stood his business partner, a lean, hard-faced man named Weston who handled various matters for Griggs that Griggs himself preferred not to touch directly. "Miss Bancroft," Griggs said, moving into the store with the ease of a man who expected every room to accommodate him. "Lovely to see you have restocked. Business must be improving." "It is," Belle said evenly, and set down the bottle of liniment she had been holding. Griggs walked the length of the counter, trailing his fingertips along the wooden edge in a proprietary way that Belle disliked intensely. "I thought I might revisit the conversation we had the other day, about the building deed." "My answer has not changed," Belle said. Griggs set his hat on the counter and looked at her directly. "Miss Bancroft, I am going to be honest with you. You cannot make $220 by the 15th. I have looked at the numbers, and I know what this store has been doing. Whatever improvement you have seen this week is not going to be sufficient." Belle kept her face calm. She did not tell him what she had in the lock box. She did not tell him about the orders she had already filled this week, or about the substantial purchase Albert had made on Tuesday. She simply looked at Griggs and said, "I suppose we will know on the 15th. Something flickered in Griggs's eyes, something that was not patience. "The offer on the table is generous," he said. "Once the foreclosure goes through, you and your father will have nothing. Not the inventory, not the building. The bank will take it all to settle the debt." "I understand how foreclosure works," Belle said. Griggs studied her for a moment, and she had the unpleasant sensation of being assessed, measured for weaknesses. Then he picked up his hat and put it on and nodded to Weston, and they went to the door. At the threshold, Griggs turned back. "My offer stands until the 14th, he said. "Think carefully, Miss Bancroft." The bell jangled and they were gone. Belle stood very still for a moment, and then she went back to the medicine shelf and finished what she had been doing, because it needed doing, and because the only useful response to Harlan Griggs was to keep working. She was still at the medicine shelf 20 minutes later when Albert came in. She had not expected him, and her face showed it before she could arrange it, and she saw his eyes sharpen when he looked at her. "What is it?" he said without preamble. Belle considered deflecting. Then she considered that she had stopped deflecting around Albert some time in the past 2 weeks and was not sure she wanted to start again. "Harlan Griggs came by," she said. "He is trying to get the building deed in lieu of the loan payment. If I give it to him, he gets the building, and my father and I are tenants in our own store, which will become his store soon enough." Albert set down the items he had been carrying and looked at her steadily. "And if you do not give it to him?" "Then I need to make the full payment in 3 days," Belle said. "I have $152 in the lock box. I need another 68. She had not intended to tell him the exact number. It came out because she was tired, and because he was the person in the room, and because somewhere in the past 2 weeks Albert Mercer had become the person she found herself telling the exact truth to without planning it. Albert was quiet for a long moment. He looked around the store, at the shelves Belle had spent weeks rebuilding, at the careful displays, at the ledger on the counter. "What is the day's total so far?" he asked. $23, Belle said. "It is a slow morning." He nodded slowly, and then he walked to the shelves and began moving through them methodically, and Belle watched him pick up items and carry them to the counter, not in the way of a man browsing, but in the way of a man who has made up his mind about something. He brought to the counter a full case of canned goods, 2 new rope coils, a set of farrier tools, a leather saddle repair kit, a good compass, 3 tins of gun oil, a bolt of heavy canvas, 2 wool blankets, a full case of coffee tins, 4 pounds of tobacco, a small cast iron pan, and a box of writing paper. Belle looked at the pile and then at Albert and could not quite find her voice. "Total those up," Albert said, and his voice was quiet and matter-of-fact, as if this were entirely ordinary commerce. Belle picked up her pencil and began to add. When she reached the end, she set the pencil down and looked at him. $71.30, she said. Albert reached into his jacket and counted out the money. He set it on the counter. He looked at her and his expression was direct and warm and something else, something that was new or perhaps not new but newly visible. "You have your $220, he said. Belle looked at the money on the counter. She had spent so many months being afraid of the number $220, holding it in her mind as an impossibility, a wall she could not get over, and now here it was, dissolved in the span of 2 weeks by a man who had walked into her store and simply chosen to spend his money where it mattered. She became aware, with some alarm, that her eyes were filling. She blinked hard and pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her eyes and then straightened her back and looked at Albert, who was watching her with an expression of great gentleness that made the situation considerably more difficult. "Albert," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "You cannot keep buying things you do not need just to help me." "Who says I do not need them?" he said. "You bought a compass," Belle said. "You have navigated cattle drives across 3 states. I do not believe you need a compass." The corner of his mouth moved. "I might need a compass," he said. "Albert." He was quiet for a moment and then he looked at her directly, with all the reserve gone from his expression, and said something that was not about the compass at all. "I need you to have this store," he said simply. "I need you to still be here when I come back tomorrow and the day after. I need this town to have Bancroft General Store in it because I intend to stay in this town, and I cannot imagine staying in it without you in it too." The store was very quiet. Belle looked at him, at his honest, weathered face, at the straightforward clarity in his eyes, and felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. "That is a great deal to read into a business transaction," she said softly. "It is not entirely a business transaction," Albert said in that low, unhurried voice. "I think you know that." She did know it. She had been knowing it for the better part of 2 weeks and doing her best to focus on inventory and debt figures instead, which had been effective in a strictly operational sense but had not solved the underlying problem. "I need to go to the bank," she said, "on the 14th, with the payment." "I know," Albert said, "and I should do that alone," she said. "It is my father's debt and my father's store, and I should be the one to walk it in." "Of course," Albert said, without any injury in it at all, which was one more thing she added to the accumulating list of things she admired about him. "But," Belle said carefully, "perhaps after." Albert waited. "Perhaps after you might come for supper," she said. "I can introduce you to my father." Something happened in Albert Mercer's face that she had not seen there before, a kind of unlocking, a warmth that came up from somewhere deep and real and changed everything about the way he looked. It was not the almost smile. It was the real thing, open and unguarded, and it was the most disarming thing she had ever seen. "I would like that very much," he said. The morning of the 14th of October, 1882 was cold and bright, with frost on the windows of the store and the kind of sky that stretched blue and endless over the mountains. Belle rose before dawn and dressed carefully in her best wool dress, dark green with cream at the collar, and she went downstairs and counted the money in the lockbox one final time, because she was that kind of person. $220.46. She made Thomas his broth and told him where she was going and why. She sat on the edge of his bed and told him the whole of it, the debt, the months of struggle, the restocking, Albert Mercer walking in and buying everything off the shelf. Thomas listened with his eyes on her face and said nothing until she was done. "This man," Thomas said then. "Mercer, what is he like?" "He is honest," Belle said. "He is thoughtful. He listens." She paused. "He came into a store that was nearly empty and spent his money to save it, and I have been trying to understand his reasons ever since." Thomas made a sound that was caught between a cough and a short laugh. "Belle," he said, with the infinite patience of a father who sees what his daughter is still circling around, "sometimes the reasons are plain." Belle looked at her father's thin, pale face, at the warmth still alive in his eyes, and felt a complicated rush of love for him that left her temporarily without words. "I have invited him to supper tonight," she said. "I hope that is all right." Thomas settled back against his pillows with an expression of deep satisfaction. "Make the apple cake," he said. "Not the plain kind, the one with the cinnamon." Belle laughed, and it was a real laugh, bright and genuine, the kind she had not had much occasion for in the past several months. She walked to the First Territorial Bank at 9 in the morning, when the sun was well up and the frost was beginning to lift off the boardwalks. She carried the money in a locked tin box that had been her mother's, because she thought her mother would have appreciated the gesture. The bank was not yet busy at that hour. A clerk looked up from behind his counter and Belle asked to see Harlan Griggs. Griggs came out of his back office looking smooth and satisfied in the way of a man who expects to be given what he wants. When he saw the tin box in Belle's hands, something changed in his expression, a tightening that he covered quickly. "Miss Bancroft," he said, "have you made your decision about the deed?" "I have," Belle said, and opened the tin and counted out $220 onto his desk in clean stacks, and then she counted out the remaining 46 cents and placed that beside them. "Payment in full," she said, "plus the 6 cents interest that accrued this week. I believe that covers everything." Griggs looked at the money for a long moment. He was very still in the way of a man who is recalculating something. "I would like a receipt," Belle said, "and the cancellation of the lien on the property. Today, please." There was a pause that lasted several seconds longer than a simple business transaction should require. Then Griggs picked up his pen and wrote the receipt and signed it, and Belle took it and folded it carefully and placed it in the tin box and closed the latch. "Good morning, Mr. Griggs," she said, and walked out of the First Territorial Bank of Dusty Creek into the clear October sunshine. She stood on the bank steps for a moment and breathed the cold, clean mountain air, and the mountains were there to the west, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the same as they had always been, and the store was 2 blocks away and free and clear and entirely hers to take care of. She went back to the store and opened for business. Albert came at 6 as they had agreed, and Belle had closed up early and made a real supper rather than the quick meals she usually managed. Roasted chicken from the butcher, potatoes she had kept in the storeroom, pickled vegetables from a jar Thomas had been given by a customer, and the apple cake with cinnamon, which had come out exactly right. She heard his knock and went to the side door that opened to the stairs, and when she opened it she found him standing in the last of the evening light with his hat in his hands and a paper-wrapped bundle that turned out, when she opened it, to contain a small bunch of late-season wildflowers he had found along the road north of town, yellow and purple, already beginning to close in the cold but still bright. "I did not know what else to bring," he said. "These are perfect," Belle said, and meant it. She put the flowers in the pitcher her mother had painted with blue birds, which lived on the windowsill of the kitchen, and she brought Albert upstairs to meet Thomas. Thomas was propped up in bed with 2 pillows and wearing his good shirt, which he had insisted on and which had taken some doing. And when Albert came in, he assessed the man standing in his doorway with the direct, unhurried eyes of a father, who has been waiting to do exactly this. Albert shook Thomas's hand with great care, being mindful of the older man's weakness, and he sat in the chair by the bed, and he talked with Thomas for nearly an hour before Belle called them to supper, and she could hear them from the kitchen, Thomas asking about the Texas cattle country, Albert answering with the particular respect of a man who understands he is being evaluated and does not resent it. She brought Thomas's tray in, and then she and Albert sat at the small kitchen table by the window, with the dark Colorado night outside and the lamp between them, and they ate the supper, and it was the most comfortable, most ordinary, most entirely extraordinary meal Belle could remember having in years. After, she served the apple cake, and Albert ate 2 slices without being asked, and said it was the best thing he had eaten since he left Texas, and she thought he was probably being generous, but found that she did not mind. They talked for a long time after the plates were cleared, about nothing urgent, about plans and ideas, about what Albert thought he might do with the land north of town if he could arrange the lease, about what Belle wanted to do with the store in the coming year, whether she might add a dressmaking section, given that the nearest seamstress was 12 miles away. At some point, Thomas called from his room that he was going to sleep, and his voice through the wall was satisfied in a way that made Belle look at the lamp, so Albert would not see her smile. Albert rose at last and put on his hat and stood at the door, and the evening had gone long and comfortable and warm in a way that was entirely new and entirely right. "Belle," he said, and he said her name with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything, "I would like to call on you properly, if you are willing." Belle looked at him in the lamplight and thought about all the ways a person's life could go, all the directions that opened up from a single moment, and felt the particular clarity of a decision that is not actually a decision because it is already made. "I think you have been calling on me for the past 2 weeks," she said. "I would like to do it properly," he said again, with a slight emphasis on the word that she understood completely. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He smiled, the full real one, and it did exactly what it had done the first time she saw it, and she thought she would probably never fully get used to that, which seemed like a fine thing. After he left, she stood in the kitchen for a moment and then went and checked on Thomas, who was not quite asleep, and who looked at her from the pillow with eyes that were entirely awake and said, with great quiet satisfaction, "Good man." "Go to sleep, Papa," Belle said, and tucked his blanket, and went to wash the supper dishes with a heart that felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely full. The weeks that followed were the best of Belle's life up to that point, and she catalogued them carefully in the way of a person who has learned not to take good things for granted. Albert came to the store most mornings, though not every morning, because he was genuinely busy now with the arrangements for the land north of town. He was leasing 40 acres from old Gerald Whitmore, who was too old to work it himself and grateful for the income. And Albert had plans that he laid out for Belle on the corner of the counter one afternoon with a stub of pencil and the back of a supply order, rough drawings of where he would put a house, where the garden would go, where the small corral would stand. He was going to run a few horses rather than cattle, he explained. There was a need in Dusty Creek for good horses, and he knew horses, and the scale was manageable for a man working mostly alone. He might add cattle later in small numbers. He was also talking to the owner of the livery stable about doing some work there in the mornings, which would give him income while the horse operation was getting started. Belle listened to all of it and pointed out, gently, that his planting area was too close to the creek for the house, that spring flooding would be a problem, and Albert looked at his rough drawing and said he had not thought about the spring flooding and moved the house on the drawing. She liked that about him, that he took useful information as useful information and did not require it to have come from a man before he could take it seriously. He formally asked Thomas for permission to court Belle on a Thursday afternoon in late October, sitting in the chair by Thomas's bed in a conversation that Belle was not present for, and which Thomas reported to her afterward with great thoroughness and visible enjoyment. He was perfectly direct about it, Thomas said, in a tone of deep approval. No hedging. Just said he had great respect for you and genuine affection, and he understood it was early and he wanted to proceed properly. What did you say? Belle asked. I said Belle would tell him herself what she thought, Thomas said, with the slight smugness of a man who is aware he has said the exactly right thing, and that if she agreed, then I had no objections whatsoever. That evening, Albert told Belle what he had said to Thomas, and Belle told him what Thomas had said in return, and Albert looked at her with those clear blue eyes and said, with characteristic directness, that he was asking her what she thought. Belle thought quite a lot of things, but the most important one was that she had been managing alone for long enough that the prospect of not managing alone, of having this particular person beside her while she did the managing, was one she wanted very much indeed. I think, she said carefully, that I agree. October turned to November and the snow came to Dusty Creek in earnest, and the store was busier than it had been in 2 years because Belle had it fully stocked and well run, and people had remembered, or were remembering, that Bancroft General Store was the kind of store where you got a fair price and a straight answer and could sit on the bench by the door for a few minutes and talk to a person who was genuinely glad to see you. Albert worked the Whitmore land on weekday mornings, came to the livery stable for the afternoon shift most days, and found his way to the store most evenings when he could. And sometimes he helped Belle restock shelves or move the heavier inventory, and sometimes they simply sat by the stove after closing and talked. He was building a life in Dusty Creek, and the watching of it was one of the things that made Belle happiest, the seeing of how a person plants themselves in a place, how they put down the first small roots. Thomas improved steadily through November. Dr. Crane said the rest had done what medicine alone could not, and by late November he was coming downstairs for an hour each afternoon, sitting in the chair behind the counter, and receiving visitors with the pleasure of a man who has been away from company too long. The first time Thomas and Albert were in the store at the same time, Belle watched them from a slight distance as they talked. Thomas asked Albert questions about the land operation, and Albert answered them seriously and also asked Thomas questions about the store and about the town, and Belle saw the satisfaction on her father's face that came from being asked rather than simply told, from having his knowledge and experience treated as something valuable. That evening, after Albert had gone, Thomas said to Belle, "He is a keeper, that one." Belle was wrapping the last of the day's deliveries and she did not look up, but she said, "I know, Papa," in a voice that she could hear was entirely unlike her usual brisk tones. Thomas made no comment, but the silence behind her was the warmest silence she had ever stood in. In December, Albert finished the foundation of his house on the Whitmore land and asked Belle to come and see it. She came on a Sunday afternoon, and they stood in the snow on the edge of what would become his front porch, and he pointed out where everything would be: the front room, the kitchen, the 2 upstairs rooms, the vegetable garden when spring came. He had chosen a spot with a view of the mountains to the west, which Belle thought was a good choice, and the creek was at a sensible distance from the house, not too far and not close enough to flood, and she thought of him moving the house on that rough pencil drawing and felt a private warmth. "It will be ready by spring," Albert said, "if the weather holds." "It is Colorado," Belle said. "The weather will not hold." He laughed, and it was a full, real laugh, and she stored it away carefully alongside all the other things she was storing. They were standing in the snow and the light was going fast in the way it did in December, and Albert turned to face her with a directness that she had come to understand was not abruptness but simply the way he was when he was certain. "Belle," he said, "I think you know where this is going." She did know. She had known for some time. "I think I do," she said. "I am not a wealthy man," Albert said. "I have my pay from the drives and I have plans and I work hard, but I cannot offer you anything grand." "I do not want anything grand," Belle said. "I have a store to run." Something in his expression softened enormously. "I know," he said, "and I would never ask you to stop running it. I think you are the best storekeeper in this county, and I intend to say so publicly and often." Belle felt the warmth move through her in spite of the cold, and she looked at him steadily. "Is that a proposal, Albert Mercer?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, which was a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, dark red and real and lovely, and she understood that he had been carrying it in his pocket for long enough to be sure. "It is," he said, "if you will have me." The mountains were enormous and white behind him, and the snow was falling lightly, and the failing light was making everything amber and soft, and Belle Bancroft looked at this steady, honest, good man standing in the snow in front of his foundation with his hat in one hand and a ring in the other, and felt the full weight and rightness of the moment settle into her bones. "I will have you," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and she saw his hands shake very slightly when he did it, which she thought was the most endearing thing she had ever witnessed. And then he looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was a long moment in which neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. He kissed her then, in the snow, in the December cold, with the mountains watching and the foundation of his house at their feet, and it was warm and certain and entirely right. They were married in February of 1883, on a Saturday morning when the whole town turned out in the way small towns do for weddings, that collective, warm investment in the happiness of two of their own. Pastor Hewitt conducted the ceremony in the stone church at the top of the rise, and the church was full of people Belle had known her whole life and people who were newer to Dusty Creek, but were becoming part of it. And Albert stood at the altar in a new suit that he had ordered from Denver, and looked at Belle, when she came down the aisle, with an expression that she thought she could stand to look at for the rest of her life without ever getting tired of it. Thomas was well enough to attend, sitting in the front pew with color in his cheeks and eyes bright with feeling, and he gave Belle his arm down the aisle with a steadiness that was more than physical, and she felt her mother's absence the way she always did at important moments, as a warmth rather than a wound, as a presence that was gone from sight but not from reach. After the ceremony there was a supper in the church hall, and people brought food and there was music from the Hendersons' fiddle, and the whole thing lasted until well into the evening, and was the kind of warm, noisy, genuine celebration that a small town in the high Colorado winter does better than almost anyone. Albert danced with her, badly and with great good humor about the badness, and Belle laughed so hard she had to hold her side, and Thomas sat at the table and watched them with his apple cake and his tea, and the expression of a man who has seen what he most needed to see. They moved into Albert's house at the end of March when it was finished and the worst of the winter was breaking, and Belle kept the store and Albert kept the land and the livery work, and they built their life in Dusty Creek the way a good house is built, solidly and with care, room by room. The spring brought mud and hard work, and in April, the first 2 horses Albert had bought for his operation, a bay mare and a gray gelding that he was already teaching to trust him with the quiet, patient method he used for most things. Belle came out to the corral on Sunday mornings and leaned on the fence and watched him work with the horses, and she thought that there was something deeply satisfying about watching a person do the thing they were genuinely good at. She was restocking the store, expanding the fabric section, adding a small selection of ready-made garments that she had begun ordering from a Denver supplier, and business was steady and growing. Dusty Creek itself was growing, with 2 new families homesteading north of town and a small schoolhouse under construction at the east end of Main Street, and Belle stocked her shelves accordingly. In May she told Albert that she was expecting a child, on a Tuesday evening when they were sitting on the front porch watching the last light leave the mountains. She had been waiting to be sure, and then waiting a little more because the news was large and she wanted to hold it for a moment before it became something they shared with the world. Albert was very still for a moment when she told him, the way he went still when something mattered deeply. Then he turned to look at her, and his face was open and full and the happiest she had ever seen it, which was saying something because she had spent several months cataloging his expressions with considerable attention. He took her hand in both of his and held it and did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Belle," in a voice that was not quite steady, and that was enough. "In December," Belle said. "I think in December. I will have the upstairs room ready," he said. "You said that 2 months ago," she said. "I meant for a different reason then," he said, and squeezed her hand, and the light went off the mountains and the evening settled in around them. She told Thomas the following Sunday, and Thomas was quiet for a moment in exactly the way Albert had been, which made her think there was perhaps something in the male character that required a moment of absolute stillness before very important things could be properly processed. Then he reached up and took her face in his thin, warm hands and said, "Your mother would be so glad." And Belle held together very well with that until she was on the road home, and then she allowed herself to simply feel it, the great ache and the great joy of it all mixed together. Thomas's health continued to improve through the summer of 1883, and by August he was back behind the counter for several hours a day, not full-time but present, moving through the store with the careful affection of a man who has been away from something he loves and is grateful to be back. Belle was glad of the help and more glad of his company, and even more glad to see him standing in his own store again with his old, quiet pride. The summer was good to them. The horses did well. Albert sold the gray gelding to a rancher up north for a good price, and used part of the money to buy a young Appaloosa mare that he was clearly already somewhat in love with, and Belle did not tease him about this because she thought it was charming. The store had its best summer in 3 years. Albert spent Saturday evenings in the store after closing, helping Belle with the heavy end-of-week restocking that had always been the most physically demanding part of the work, and they had fallen into a rhythm there too, working together in the lit store with the town quiet outside, and Belle thought sometimes that this was the most domestic happiness imaginable, and that it was precisely what she had always wanted without knowing it clearly until she had it. Harlan Griggs was not exactly a changed man, but he was a somewhat quieter one. His mercantile still operated on the other end of Main Street, and Belle did not fool herself that the competition was gone, but the edge of it had changed. The town had made clear, in the quiet way of small towns, that it supported Bancroft General Store, and Griggs was a practical man who understood when a battle was not worth the ammunition. He came into the store once in July, which surprised Belle. He came in, walked the length of the shelves, bought a tin of tobacco and a packet of matches, and paid without a word of negotiation. At the door he turned and said, "You have improved the stock considerably." "Thank you," Belle said. He nodded once and left. Belle watched the door swing shut and decided it was the closest thing to a concession she was going to get, and that it was sufficient. September came, and then October, and then November, which brought the first hard snow of the season and the deep cold that settled into the mountain valleys and did not lift until March. The house was warm, Albert having built the fireplace with particular care and laid in a substantial supply of split wood, and Belle ran the store through the cold with Thomas's help and came home in the evenings to a fire lit, and supper most nights already started, because Albert came home from the livery stable before she closed the store, and he had taken to cooking with an earnestness she found entirely delightful. He was not a talented cook, but he was improving, and he approached cooking with the same methodical sincerity he brought to everything, which meant that he got better, and that the failures were spectacular rather than merely mediocre. On a cold December night, the 14th of December, 1883, with snow falling outside the window and the fire high in the grate, their son was born. He came into the world in the small hours of the morning, attended by Dr. Crane and Mrs. Henderson, who had been the town's informal midwife for 20 years and was extremely good at her work. Albert was in the front room and was not entirely composed, a fact he acknowledged later with a candor that made Belle love him more rather than less. He was a healthy boy, dark-haired, which he got from Belle, with eyes that were still the indeterminate blue of newborns, but that Belle already suspected would settle into something very like his father's. They named him Thomas James Mercer, Thomas for Belle's father, James for Albert's. And when Thomas Bancroft held his grandson for the first time, sitting in the chair by the fire with the baby in his arms and the snow coming down outside, his expression was one of such complete and quiet joy that Belle pressed her face briefly into Albert's shoulder so she would not cry in front of the doctor. Albert put his arm around her and held her firmly, and she felt him press his lips briefly to the top of her head. And the fire was warm and the snow was soft outside, and Thomas James Mercer was 10 minutes old and entirely perfect. The years that followed built on each other with the particular satisfying accumulation of a life well lived. Thomas Bancroft recovered fully enough to work the store 3 days a week through 1884 and into 1885, and those were good years for the store and good years for the town. Dusty Creek grew steadily. The schoolhouse was completed and a second teacher hired by 1885, and a doctor's office opened properly instead of relying on old Willis Crane's house calls. Albert's horse operation expanded carefully and consistently. By 1885, he had 8 horses and had built a second small corral and a proper stable, and he had a reputation in the county for breeding and training horses with a particular quality of temperament, which was what serious riders cared about most. He had also, by that year, given up the livery stable work, because the horse operation was sustaining itself, and he preferred to be on his own land. Belle's store had become something her father had always believed it could be, the actual heart of Dusty Creek's commercial life, stocking everything a growing town needed and providing a place where people felt known and welcome. She hired a young woman named Clara to help behind the counter in 1885, which gave her the ability to manage the ordering and the accounts with less of the constant standing and serving that had been wearing her thin, and also gave her the first real break she had taken in years. Thomas Bancroft died peacefully in the autumn of 1886, on a golden October morning, not entirely unlike the morning Albert had first walked into the store. He had been declining gently through the summer, his lungs finally doing what the doctor had always said they eventually would, and the end when it came was quiet and without pain, with Belle beside him and little Thomas James, who was nearly 3, asleep in the next room. Belle grieved him deeply and completely, and Albert was beside her through all of it with the steadiness that was the bedrock of who he was, never minimizing or rushing, simply present in the way that mattered most. She cried when she needed to cry and worked when she needed to work and talked about Thomas when she needed to talk, and Albert listened to all of it. She put Thomas Bancroft's name above the store door on a simple painted board that fall, Thomas Bancroft, Est 1862, and beneath it in smaller letters continued by his daughter. It felt right. It felt like a true account of things. The winter of 1886 was hard, as Colorado winters often were, but the spring was glorious, and Belle discovered in March of 1887 that she was expecting again, their second child. She told Albert in the same way she had told him the first time, on the porch in the evening, and he was still in the same way, and then he looked at her with the same full happiness. And it was the same as the first time and also entirely different because they were 3 years further into each other's lives now, and the love had depth as well as light. Their second child, born in October of 1887, was a boy they named William, after no one in particular but the name they had both always liked. William was a rounder, more immediately cheerful baby than Thomas James had been, which made the house considerably noisier but not unpleasantly so. Thomas James, who was nearly 4 by then, inspected his new brother with solemn seriousness, and after some consideration announced that he was acceptable, which Albert said was generous praise from a 4-year-old. Belle ran the store into the 1890s, and it was the anchor she had always intended it to be, through the changing economics of the territory, through the continued growth of Dusty Creek, through good years and harder ones. She made improvements and adjustments, updated the inventory as things changed, and kept the fundamental character of the store, the fairness and the welcome and the genuine relationship with the community around it, exactly as her father had always maintained it. Albert's horse operation became the best regarded in that part of Colorado. He had a particular gift for the work that was recognized widely, and by 1890 he was supplying horses to ranchers across 3 counties. He also kept the land well, maintaining a kitchen garden that Belle had expanded considerably over the years, and the house had been added to twice, a proper back kitchen in 1885 and a second upstairs room in 1888, when it became clear that William was old enough to want his own space, and Thomas James was old enough to want his brother out of his. They had their arguments, as all people do, and their difficult seasons, when money was tighter, or the work was heavier, or the exhaustion of it all sat on them more heavily than usual. But underneath all of it was the deep, reliable current of the thing that had begun in a nearly empty store on an October morning in 1882, that clear-eyed recognition, that absolute willingness to see and be seen, that particular love that does not require anyone to be something they are not. On a Saturday morning in the fall of 1892, 10 years to the month after Albert Mercer had first walked through the door of Bancroft General Store, Belle was behind the counter when she heard the bell above the door and looked up with the same bright smile she had always produced on command. Albert came through the door, trailed dust on his coat from the morning ride down from the Northland, hat in hand in the way she had thought unexpectedly courteous the very first time she saw it. Behind him, Thomas James, who was 9 now and beginning to have his father's build, and William, 7, who had his mother's dark curls and was at the moment examining the candy display with an expression of deep professional seriousness. Albert came to the counter and leaned on it and looked at her, and he had all the weathering and lived-in quality of a man who had worked hard for 10 years, which she found, if anything, more appealing than what she had seen across this same counter a decade ago. "Morning," he said in that low, unhurried Texas drawl. "Morning," she said. "What can I help you with, Mr. Mercer?" He tilted his head slightly, recognizing the game and the warmth in it. "I seem to remember buying a great many things in this store some years ago." "You did," Belle agreed, "and I intend to charge you fair prices today just as I did then." The corner of his mouth moved into the full, real smile, the one that had been undoing her for 10 years and showed every sign of continuing to do so indefinitely. "Belle," he said softly, in the voice he used when the boys were not close enough to hear, and the words were just for her, "you know that was the best money I ever spent." She looked at him across the counter of her father's store, her store, the store she had refused to give up on, the store that had in its way given her everything, and she thought about 11 days and $43.16, and a stranger walking through the door with clear blue eyes and a willingness to simply show up and spend his money where it mattered. "I know," she said, and reached across the counter and covered his hand with hers, right there in the store in the middle of a Saturday morning, with the whole town potentially looking in through the front windows and the boys arguing over peppermint sticks, and the October light doing its beautiful, familiar work on the mountains to the west. His hand turned under hers and held it. Outside, Dusty Creek went about its morning, horses and wagons on Main Street, the school bell ringing in the distance, the mountains standing where they had always stood, enormous and patient and unmoved by the small human business of love and debt and hope, and the particular courage of a young woman who had refused to let her father's store fail. The sign above the door said Thomas Bancroft, Est 1862, and under it his daughter's name, and under that because Albert had climbed up there one Sunday morning with a brush and a steady hand, and Belle had watched from the street with her arms crossed and her heart impossibly full, in small, neat letters, and family. Clara brought a customer to the counter and Belle straightened and turned with her professional smile, which was only partly professional at this point, and partly something else entirely. Albert herded the boys away from the candy with the amused patience of a man who has long understood that some battles are not battles, but simply the daily texture of life, and the store settled into its Saturday morning rhythm, busy and warm and full of everything a good store should be. And when the last customer had gone that evening and the door was locked and the lamp was low and the boys were upstairs and Albert was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and Belle was going over the day's ledger, she looked at the numbers and the numbers were good, and she looked up from the numbers and he was already looking at her, the way he always seemed to be when she looked up. "Good day?" he asked. "Very good day," she said. She set down the pencil and closed the ledger and crossed the room to where he was sitting, and he moved his chair without being asked to make room, and she sat beside him in the warm kitchen with the Colorado night outside and the lamp burning steadily between them, and it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was a whole life, built on a morning when a man walked into an empty store and chose to stay, and a woman behind the counter chose to believe that things could get better, and both of them turned out to be exactly right.